Right, we've lots of folks just coming in, Carol and Gary. Still a lot coming in, so I'll just give you another chat in just a moment. When we think we've everyone in, we can get started.
That's fine. We don't want to break the internet. Again. And you see those pictures of people meeting and greeting. It's like something from a different world, isn't it, Carl?
Do you know what's really strange? I actually had to do an interview in somebody's house today, and he's an older gentleman, and we were pre-recording an interview, and he was definitely trying to shake hands, and I was trying to protect him, and he clearly was oblivious to the whole thing. It was very difficult to maintain social distancing. Yeah.
Now we're a welcoming bunch, you know.
It feels very alien not to shake hands with people. It's, you know, it's definitely one of the biggest things I'm finding. Yeah. Yeah, it's a habit.
You have to use your elbow.
You know what? I find it's like that awkward thing when you don't know whether you're going in for one kiss or two in a greeting. It's suddenly you're going in, you're both holding your hands up, and then you're taking a step back. It's like a little dance.
We should be okay to start now, Sarah, maybe.
Yes, it's certainly Sloan. We have hundreds in, and we're ready to go. I'll hand over to you, Carol.
So, hello and welcome to the Host in Ireland discussion on green data factories and new economic opportunities. 2020 so far has certainly been a year of extremes. We have been tested personally, professionally, financially, medically, and in every way that it's possible for a person, a corporate entity, and indeed a nation and a global population to be tested. So the timing of this webinar is important and relevant. I'm particularly grateful to the Host in Ireland team, ably led by Gary Connolly, for bringing together industry leaders in digitization, data, energy, and talent to discuss how the data center sector and its supply chain has been affected by events over the past 7 months. So I'm delighted to be joined for this webinar, webinar one, by Host in Ireland President Gary Connolly and by emerging technology analyst George Kamea. And before we get started, I would just like, and I know that we have many people joining us live, and of course this event is being live streamed, but it's also being recorded. For people who are joining us live, I would ask that you take part in polls, and certainly feel free to submit your questions for our panelists in both webinar 1 and webinar 2. And just to kick us off, we have a bit of a poll that we'd like to get really opinion on. So just to start, of the people in attendance here, how many people here have benefited from a data center over the past 24 hours? So if you've used or benefited from a data center over the past 24 hours, please submit yes, no, or don't know. And we'll come back and revisit that towards the end of our discussion. First, I'm going to hand you over to Gary Connolly to discuss the growth of the data center sector over the past decade. Gary, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for everybody for joining us, George, and obviously the team, Michelle and Sarah and Tanya. Thanks a million for lining everything up. And what I thought I'd do just initially was to give some sort of a sense of, you know, data centers, things like industrial revolution. We hear it all the time, but the reality is that there's a lot of people know about it, and there's a lot of more people that don't understand it. So just to give some context, I thought it would be helpful to get my presentation running first, which is obviously a challenge right now. Let's see, hold on a second.
You could see that perfect.
Could you? You could see the first one, but you couldn't see the flick on. Hold on. This is the NSA, you see. They always do this to my presentations just before I do it. Just stay there.
Actually, I think that this is a very good example of how we've been living over the past 7 to 8 months. And actually, it really highlights when we have this discussion about broadband, sometimes some of the essentials get lost in that conversation. So I think that this really epitomizes our shift online. Everybody has had to adapt. There's no choice.
Carol, you're so lovely. I'd love to blame the technology, but in this case, it's just me. So
user error.
95 to 99% of all technology errors are the humans. So I'll take it on board. But effectively, you hear people talking about the Industrial Revolution 4.0 or Manufacturing 4.0 or Industry 4.0. But, a lot of us don't realize that it's a phrase and a term that was coined by the United Nations. Around 2014, they declared that we're in the Industrial Revolution 4.0. And effectively, if you look back, it's easier to understand sort of what drove the first one. Well, the first one was driven by steam. It was the catalyst. They got the pistons running. They got the steamships running. They got the trains going. The payloads were distributed, and the world became a smaller place. Well, data is that in this industrial revolution. There's no question that this data and its supporting infrastructure is without question one of the greatest disruptions that we've seen. And it is a weapon of mass distraction. I mean, everywhere we look, we see where it's distracting people, where attention span is 140 characters. But that often, and unfortunately, if it bleeds, it leads, masks the fact that we're in the most wonderful time where we have these tools and services at our disposal. And we should more than not look at data and its supporting infrastructure as a mechanism and a weapon of mass invention. And that is effectively what the growth is in this space. When we look at going back, we see words like the internet, the superhighway, now the net. Effectively, it is the connected planet. It's our desire to connect things that are of use to us, whether it's for security, whether it's for training, whether it's for our own business, our schooling. Connected up securely is the key thing. And when we look at the number of devices, we've gone way past the one device for every one person on the planet, probably a decade ago. And we're now moving towards the 50 billion connected things to our planet. And that's incredible when you bear in mind that we still only have about 4.9 billion of the 7 billion people connected. There's still nearly 2 billion people on this planet that aren't connected at all. COVID came, Q1, what happened? Well, in many respects, all that's happened is we've seen an acceleration of the digitization, or words that we hear like the digital transformation of industries. What's happened more and more is that industries that thought that they could live without full-scale digitization have been forced into going online for all aspects of their business, because we haven't had anything other than an online universe for the past 6 months, and possibly in a blended way for the next 6 to 9 to 12 months, optimistically. So what we've seen is, as the chart demonstrates, an acceleration of the amount of connected things, the amount of connected industries. You might have seen in that previous presentation, the cannabis industry, one of the fastest growing online industries in the world, the legal version of it. But as you can see, every industry now is a digital industry. And that is effectively what's growing the requirement for secure locations to store, forward, and distribute data. And we look at Ireland. And again, history is a great thing to look at. These guys from IBM in 1956, when they started to use Ireland as a digital gateway, didn't really know at that time that 20 to 30 years later, with their embryonics, that Ireland will be recognized 20 years ago, nearly to this day, as the largest exporter of software in the world, bar none. Because we were the center of the universe for localization. We used to take the software from all over the world, we'd localize it to German, French, Italian, we'd tweak it, we'd export it. But what's interesting is, if anybody is on this call that's probably under the age of 30, They probably don't know what these things are that I have on the screen. They're the medium that we used only 20 years ago to export from Ireland, to be the largest exporter of the world. Floppy disks, 3.5 inch, 5.25. And effectively, that was the year we were announced as the largest software exporter in the world. And nobody uses these anymore. So what transformation took place between now and then, where we can actually say we're still one of the largest software as a service exporters in the world? Well, we got really busy, we got really brave, we got relentless, and we got creative with our reinvention by putting all of this network around Ireland so that we could deliver the software over fiber optic cable. So going back to the first analogy that we had about the Industrial Revolution, you know, the steamships are the equivalent of the fiber cables that were connecting up Ireland, because we weren't delivering our software anymore in 40-foot containers. We were delivering them now over fiber. So fiber networks that are on the eastern seaboard in particular, that are all crescendo down to a central location in the greater Metro Dublin area, and some of the off-island fibers that go off to the United States. These are the ships of the equivalent. So that's how we got creative. And that's why when we look now at Dublin and the greater Metro Dublin in particular, we're still one of the largest software exported locations in the world, not just Europe, with 700 odd megawatts and another gig on the way. And that is the difference. And that's how we transformed from 2000 to 2020. We transformed how we deliver the software. So how do we move forward? Well, we've got to be brave, creative, and relentless again. Not in what we've done before, because we've achieved our significant status by constantly changing. The next wave now is how do we take the digital footprint that we've already got the pedigree and fuel it with the ample resource that we have in renewable energy. And therefore, when you see this slide, and not enough, and it's not often enough discussed, Ireland has nearly 10 times, if not 15 times, more energy generating capacity than we can ever consume. We've got a sea mass 7 times larger than our land mass, and it's just ready and willing and able with the technologies that are there, with solar, with onshore, with offshore wind, with hydrogen gas, to take this natural resource and turn it into something else, which is green data, and export the green data as an end product rather than exporting it as just electricity, which would be like the equivalent of the old mines in places like South Africa and Namibia, exporting the wonderful asset they had of the diamonds for somebody to make more money in somewhere like Antwerp. That's what we don't want to happen. So this is a challenge that we're going to have this decade, is to make sure we decarbonize the state, along with using that raw material or natural asset, which is renewable energy, to put into an industry and export it with the job and economic benefits. So I think that's a wonderful way of linking now into George, because really what's happened over the last 10 years in particular, but maybe 20, is we've started to be comfortable with this thing called the dematerialization of the planet. Stuff is disappearing and it's becoming an app. And it's not only you see this little fast track video that you say, you know what, 10 years ago, that was my desk. And now in a couple of years, or maybe now, it's a headset. So George and his work with the IEA has always tried, and I've enjoyed your work as an analyst, George, because you've always tried, in my opinion, to not look at the gross. You've always tried to look at the net effect of the digitization of the planet. So rather than just looking at what goes into the center, you've tried to take a view of what effects the data is having with other industries. And I think it's a natural place to hand over to you and listen to some of the work you're doing. And I know that, Carol, you're going to come in 7 or 8 minutes and we'll have a chat.
All right, thanks so much, Gary. That was a very great, very good introduction to what I'm about to talk about. So let me just pull up my slides.
Gary, if I could just get you to stop sharing, thanks. We see that perfect, George.
Great. Okay, so all right, so I've got 8 minutes. I'll try to get through this quickly so we can have a nice discussion. So, so at the IEA, so the International Energy Agency, where I'm from, we look at energy security, energy access, and energy transition. So this is the digitalization part is one part of it. We've been working on it for a couple of years now, starting with our 2017 report, Digitalization and Energy. So in that, we talked about some of these applications of digital technologies to, save money, reduce emissions across the energy system. So I'm going to briefly run through some of the trends we're seeing in digitalization, digital technologies, what that means for energy use, and what that means for climate change. So this is an interesting table, I think, because it shows the scale of change and the pace of change in digitalization. So, the top 3 are kind of population, economic indicators, energy, significant growth, but fairly modest compared to the bottom 3 that we see, where internet users have grown over the last 20 years, over 10 times. Internet traffic has grown by more than 2,000 times. So just the pace of change and growth in the digital world is quite unlike, I think, any other sector. Which is why we end up with headlines like this, where there's predictions that all this digital infrastructure is going to consume a lot of energy, result in a lot of emissions. You might have seen this one about a tsunami of data could consume 1/5 of global electricity by 2025, which is just in 5 years. Here's one from about 20 years ago from Forbes. Dig more coal, the PCs are coming. And you can see on the right-hand side, it's saying it could consume about half the electricity in the US in a couple of years. So I've got a first poll question. What do you think, how much electricity do you think data centers use as a percentage of global electricity demand today? I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. You can see it's not, I've not even put in the 1/5 of electricity here. And let's move to.
You have a great response there. You want me to share those results, George?
Sure, yeah. Interesting. Okay, so most common is 2%, followed by 5%, followed by 1%. So very interesting, because the answer is actually 1%. This is really, here are some of the headlines. So there's this big paper in Science earlier this year saying how data centers had grown rapidly, but the energy consumption had stayed flat. So this was consistent with the analysis we've done at the IEA. So the graph on the left here kind of describes what's been going on. So, I said the internet traffic has been growing very rapidly in red there. Data center workloads are also increasing rapidly, but data center energy use has been flat over the last decade. And why is that? Really 2 main factors. One is a major shift from traditional, less efficient, smaller data centers, enterprise corporate data centers, to much more efficient cloud and hyperscale data centers. So that's one of the main factors. The other is really the increasing efficiency of all compute. So, there's this law called Kumi's law, where it describes doubling of energy efficiency of compute every 2 to 3 years. So it's really those 2 main drivers that have been able to keep data center energy demand flat over the past decade, despite this huge increase in internet traffic and demand. So you may be wondering, what about those headlines that we saw? So this is it's originally from a 2015 study by Andre and Edler. So you can see how, their worst case scenario predicted a very high energy consumption in 2030. Since then, he's revised those estimates downwards. So his most recent estimate, as you can see in the dark red, the estimates are much lower. In reality, our analysis, which is much more bottom up, shows that this very flat electricity growth demand. The other factor is how are these data centers powered? And it's largely coming from renewable energy now, more and more. ICT companies on the left, you can see, are leading sectors in terms of global renewables procurement for corporations. And you can see on the right graph that 4 of the top 10, or actually 6 of the top 10 are big data center operators. So Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, among them. So on the renewable energy side, they're making a lot of progress. I mentioned Kumi's law, which describes how quickly the efficiency is improving. On the right, we see another study that looked at the efficiency of data transmission. So this is through data transmission networks, optical fibers, Wi-Fi, mobile. That's also improving very rapidly. So you're reducing energy consumption through efficiency, and hopefully the remaining energy consumption can be powered by renewables. So to that end, the ICT sector jointly announced, so GSMA, ITU, Jesse announced a big science-based target to reduce emissions, I think by 45% over the next decade. The big announcement earlier this year, showing kind of the leadership in the sector. So the next section, I'll talk about streaming video, but let's put up another poll question. How many hours of Netflix do you think would emit as much CO2 as we can change this to Dublin to New York, actually. Yeah, but you can pose your guess here. The reason I ask is you may have seen you may have seen headlines like this. Oh, great. So the responses have come in. 41% say 70,000 hours, 38% say 7,000 hours, and only 21% of you said 180 hours, which is what this study here would correspond to. They said that half an hour of watching on-demand video would emit 1.6 kilograms of CO2, which is a very high amount. So there were a lot of headlines like this based on this study from the Shift project. So I worked to publish this fact check on whether this was realistic or not. So the results basically show that a lot of the assumptions they'd made were out of date or inaccurate. So you can see that our estimate, the IEA estimate there, is much lower than what was published and what was repeated in the headlines. You can see how it compares to other regular day-to-day activities. And you can see that the electricity mix is very important. So for instance, in France, where I am, our electricity is very low carbon, so very low emissions. You can go to the IEA website. There's a calculator there where you can calculate the kind of emissions that you might expect from different types of devices, different resolutions, different networks, and then based on the country you're in. So I'm just about to wrap up, but one more thing about COVID. So through COVID, the crisis, we saw very large growth in data transmission. So Netflix streaming hit all-time highs on different networks. So then I think the European Commission worked with YouTube and Netflix to try to reduce some of the bit rate, to reduce congestion. On the right here, interestingly, you can see that GSMA, the mobile network operator group, said that despite this large growth in data traffic, about 50% more than usual, a lot of their operators were able to keep their electricity demand flat. So it's very promising. Which gets to my last point about the kind of direct and indirect effects of ICT. So now that we're doing more of these video conferences, working from home, what does that mean for overall energy and emissions? So it's a very complicated topic. It's not just reducing emissions necessarily. Of course, now that we're at home, there's more electricity consumption going on at home instead of in commercial buildings. But we're not commuting to work anymore, so there's savings on the transportation side. And then, of course, longer term, if we do more and more telecommuting, there are questions of whether that might lead to more structural changes. Like, would we choose to live further from cities? Would we buy bigger homes? Would we buy cars because now we are in a situation where we might need those transportation options? So it's a very difficult and complicated topic, but I think it warrants further study. My last point is that, I've talked about data center energy demand being flat. one thing we need to be aware of is that efficiency trends are beginning to slow. So, and we're seeing more and more new uses of technology. So whether it's artificial intelligence, here on the right, you see a study that tried to quantify that, blockchain, Bitcoin, artificial augmented reality, those kind of things could have growth in emissions, growth in energy use and data center demand. So these are things we need to continue to pay attention on. And I think I'll end there. Hopefully I haven't gone over time, but happy to take questions and discuss more in depth. But here's some references I think that would be helpful if you're looking for more information.
Okay, George, thank you so much for that. And Gary, thank you very much for that really insightful interview overview. And I think it's really interesting. The video you played with the desk really showcases, you know, in the manner of show, don't tell. It really shows the development. Now, just to remind people that we are, of course, accepting questions. Just type your question into the Q&A box down the bottom, and you will have the opportunity to upvote on any questions that you would like to make sure get presented to the panel. So please continue to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. And I think before we get started, George, I would just like to ask you there, you know, it's interesting, you started your presentation talking about maybe some of the more almost clickbait type headlines, talking about and forecasting that, you know, 50% of energy consumption could go to powering the internet. And then you ended by saying some of the emerging technologies like augmented reality might actually have a greater impact than we expect. Is it likely? Is it possible that this is history repeating itself? Are you predicting that these emerging technologies like augmented reality, just because you've used that as the example, maybe won't be the energy consumer that you're expecting now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not making any predictions beyond a couple of years. So for instance, our forecasts only go out to 2022 right now. So I think the point I wanted to make there, and you know, those kind of past headlines as examples, is it's really difficult to predict the pace of change that we're seeing in digital technology. So, you know, we could talk about these kind of emerging technologies. We really don't have a good sense of how those are going to be used in 5, 10 years, 15 years, much less how do we predict what the energy use and the energy footprint or the carbon footprint of those things are going to be. So I guess the takeaway I'd like people tuning in today would be to be a little skeptical about those predictions that go out too far into the future, because nobody really knows what's going to be happening in 2030, 2040 around these very rapidly changing technologies. So, you know, I talked about AI, blockchain is kind of what's kind of cutting edge right now, but who knows what technologies will emerge over the next 5 to 10 years. And of course, the other side being, we might discover, or there might be innovation around even more efficient technologies. So maybe 15 years ago, we weren't thinking about hyperscale data centers or the kind of, you know, efficiency gains we were able to get from computing. So that was, you know, not predicted. So, and then the other thing is the pace of change and use of digitalization can also impact other sectors. So, you know, for instance, digital twins could help rapidly innovate in the industrial sector, for instance. Maybe we don't have to do physical prototyping anymore, and we could use digital technologies. So I guess, yeah, the takeaway being, I'm not going to make a prediction of what's going to happen in 2030, 2040 around energy use. We should focus on that fact that, you know, efficiency gains might begin to slow or are beginning to slow. So we do need to start innovating on these next generation technologies. We can't, you know, say, oh, you know, in the past it's been flat, but, you know, that was thanks to a lot of efficiency gains. We need, you know, more efficiency gains and also new technologies to kind of continue that trend. So,
okay,
yeah.
So that's a fair takeaway there, to say that actually we can't become complacent in what's been achieved so far, and we need to innovate at to solve the problems at the same scale that we're innovating new solutions. Yes. I'm going to move straight over to the Q&A now, because we have a number of questions here entered. So look, we'll start with one here. It's agreed that Ireland has tremendous potential to harness wind and solar energy, particularly onshore and offshore wind. However, the exploitation of these energy sources require major investment in the grid and wider transmission system. Also, investment is required to support backup systems to supply power when wind and solar power is not available. So any thoughts on the challenge and scale of investment that's required to reconfigure the grid and put into place the backup systems? Gary, I might hand that over to you because it probably resonates with a lot of what you were talking about.
Well, I guess there's an advantage in one respect from a society being classified as a laggard with regard to our carbon citizenship. And that's where you can have a look at the current best practices and learn from other places. So as we enter now into 2020, and I think we're looking at the 2030 sort of, decarbonization program for government, all this type of stuff, you see the increase in awareness of offshore in particular, as the question asks. The capacity on offshore Ireland is just ridiculous in terms of the amount of generating capacity we have. What I would say is that looking at the current air grid build out, we've already got factored 2 gigawatts in the program, in the budgets, in the reinforcements. And that's before, and it gets quite technical and I don't understand all of it, that's even before we start to look at what's called green hydrogen, which is really the holy grail, because that's where you're taking wind, you're turning it into another form of energy that can be stored, can be distributed. And to the question exactly, it doesn't always have the sun or the wind shining, well, not in Ireland anyway, or the wind blowing. So you have to be able to have something there that can be fired up, that you can use when all the others aren't used. And batteries are part of the solution, but green hydrogen seems to be a bigger part, not in Ireland as yet, but that gives you that on demand. The capital spend is interesting because I think in Ireland we have this thing, unfortunately, where every time a large project uses a lot of energy, the taxpayer pays for it all. Whereas in actual fact, for the latest very large scale renewable projects, particularly on the corporate power purchase side, is being funded by the likes of Amazon, Facebook and others. And their PSO levy has gone up by 189%, as well as the consumers. So it's a decarbonization of the grid, number one. The second thing is that the lads in Airgrid have already factored in 2 gigawatts, I think. So it's not like, and that's one of the advantages we're finding at the moment is in emerging places for data center, as distinct to Ireland, which is an evolved place, is that Airgrid and AESB Networks and the other grid guys, we've been talking to them for 15 years. So they're able to now understand that they don't need 500 car park spaces for the data center. These are discussions that other places are having. But yeah, to the point of the question, absolutely capital is required. Capital is required anyway to decarbonize our grid, to hit 70% by 2030.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I know that we could go deeper into that. I hope that answers your question, Jim Brown. Thank you for submitting that. But because we have a number of questions to get through here, we're going to try fly through a few more. So there's a question here from Carl Fagan. How do you envisage resilience by design to evolve? So he gives the example there that we're obsessed by speed and pace, and oftentimes it's who's first as opposed to who's best placed to have a positive impact for social good. So, he's referring to innovation by lead users, the efficiency gains versus the losses. So how could this be regulated, if at all? For example, if we see district heating projects run by Facebook in Odense in Denmark, repurposing energy or byproducts of the processes. So I think that that's a fair question. So again, how do we envisage the resilience by design to evolve? And in terms of innovation by lead users, judging against the efficiency gains versus the losses, how could it be regulated?
There's an awful lot in that. You're switching over between the data in the center and the center itself. So if I pick out one thing that I can actually hang a coat on, it's the district heating question.
Okay.
all data centers have the capacity, whether they're in Ireland, Gdansk, or Timbuktu, to get rid of their excess heat. It's into what is the question. In Nordics and other geographic places around, particularly North Europe, they've been using district heating for not decades, for centuries. So they already have a lot of the stuff to take the waste heat. Ireland, for instance, we have one evolving prototype for district heating running around a data center in Tala. But the waste heat that's coming out of the data center in Tala is the same waste heat that's available in Clonee as the same waste heat that's available in Blanchardstown. It's just that in Blanchardstown and Clonee, they don't have district heating systems capable of taking the heat. So it's a societal connection. It's easier to do it. We already have the place to use the waste heat. And I'm sure you see that as well, George. You know, there's no real magic bullet. These are societal connection points for a smart city. Some cities are better equipped beforehand to accelerate quicker on the smart city connected district heating system.
Yeah, exactly. You need the end users. If the data center is far away from where the people live, there's no use.
And that's it in point. Gdansk has had I'm sure, a district heating system for forever.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
So
Sorry, gentlemen. I'm going to move you along because actually there's an increasing number of questions here, and I want to make sure that we can actually touch off some of the other trends that we're seeing, actually not just in the questions, but I would ask people who are submitting questions as well, maybe to look at existing questions that are there in the Q&A box and upvote on those so we can prioritize which questions to get to. George, there's a question here for you. It's asking, is George seeing any trend globally for data centers converting their waste heat into an asset? And that's a little bit what we've touched on there, but you might just address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Denmark example is the only one I'm personally aware of. And I think what I've heard is that the main challenge being connecting the waste heat to the users and having the infrastructure. So exactly what Gary said.
Okay, well then we'll move on.
Dublin. We have one in Dublin.
Sorry?
As I said, we have a prototype, the first one in Ireland, in Tala. Codema is the agency that's looking after it. It's using the waste heat from an Amazon data center in Tala to go to the municipality buildings. So they're using it like a prototype. Okay.
Thank you for that information. And again, all of this information will be available on the Host in Ireland website. And we'll just jump on to the next question there from John Butler. What is the best way that a data center operator can support renewable investment? So at the moment here, there's procurement of wind farms to offset data center energy consumption. So are technology providers interested in becoming wind farm operators?
I think the same question as, do bakers really want to become farmers? Do bakers really want to grow their own corn? You've got to look at your core business activity. And that's, the data center guys are fundamentally data dudes. You know, they have to have a center to deliver the data. The best way and the most optimum way of doing it, if we're looking at it, is signing on-grid power purchase agreements, because that drives then more supply, which ultimately decarbonates the grid that they're connecting onto. I don't think, and it's a great question, because you see in the United States in particular, you know, solar farms were 2 gigawatts. That's 40% of Ireland's consumption in 4 states away, being signed up by a hyperscale, but they're consuming it closer to where their data center is. So, you know, my sense is look at traditional businesses and give you a better indicator. Data center dudes are data dudes. If they can, they want to connect to the grid, and they want to be able to put more electrons onto the grid to take it off somewhere, bearing in mind that it all goes into a pot, because the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. If you had a data center here and wind farm here and a solar here, what do you do when you don't have enough coming from the natural? That's why they like to be grid connected. We like to see on-grid power purchase agreements, not sort of an agreement from another geography. But I think that's fundamental.
Okay, Gary, I will never tire of you referring to people in the industry as data dudes. I think it's just perfect. I'll never tire of it. Thank you. There's a question here from Matthew Dooley. Do you see a risk to Irish data centre development as a result of Brexit and the implications to data transfer under GDPR between the EU and the UK? And he goes on to quote the Financial Times. Google has announced it will move its data about British users of its service, including Gmail, YouTube, and Android Play Store, from Ireland to the US as it seeks to avoid legal risks after Brexit.
There's no less risk to the data that resides in the centres in Ireland than any other business unit operating in Ireland due to Brexit. In fact, what we've seen is, because we're in EU, and more importantly right now than Brexit, etc., is Ireland uses a common law legal structure. The last location in Europe that uses the common law legal structure, now that Britain's gone, everyone else uses civil law. So that's fundamental. One of the things, and it's very basic, and I don't know the origins of the question that's been asked, because if there's any privacy issues around and personal identifiable information from what they're relocating to the States, that's a bigger issue than relocating to France.
Now, just to clarify, I think the question as well was relating to a risk to the Irish data centre development, as opposed to the data.
We've seen it. Well, it's the same deal. It's the data. It's the data. You need. The centers are only there because of the data. Data is only there created if there's a place for it. And if I understand the question correctly, the only risk that we have right now is the slowdown in any off-island fiber cables that are being developed and are currently underway that circumnavigate the UK. There's a physical risk, not a virtual risk.
Okay, and I think the question really is, if data on British users is being sent to the US as opposed to Ireland, would that reduce the need for data centres in Ireland?
I can't see an awful lot of data residing on British citizens being anywhere hosted, bar the UK anyway, for their own data privacy issues.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question here. What types of innovation in data centres should we expect if we are to maintain the level of efficiency that we have seen thus far? And I think, George, that's possibly referring to yours, where you talked specifically about a 12-fold increase in internet usage, whereas energy consumption has only seen a 3% increase over the past decade. So what types of innovation in data centres should we expect if we are to maintain the level of efficiency we have seen thus far?
Yes, so I mean, continuing to see those trends that we've already seen. So continuing to see shifts from less efficient traditional data centers to hyperscalers. But on the innovation side, I mean, I think cooling is still an area that there's still a lot of untapped potential there, especially as some of these data centers start opening up in warmer climates. So I think we've been fortunate that, to have big data centers operating in cooler climates. But, what happens when we have hyperscalers opening up in India and in sub-Saharan Africa, where we might have to deal with higher cooling loads. So I think that's an interesting area. I know there's innovations around liquid cooling. I know Microsoft has done a trial submerging their data centers in water. So I'm not sure about the specifics, but I think that's definitely an area.
But I think
sorry, come ahead, Gary.
It's very important to remember there's a business being run, and if 70% of your operating expense for a business is electricity, any business, say it's flour, you are going to work on the optimum way of reducing that operating expense. So both the greenest and the most efficient electricity is the electricity not used. So therefore, when you start to look at some of the stuff that George is talking about, immersive cooling, you also have the data center, particularly the larger data center guys, where they're actually now allowing the server rooms be much hotter, because what was the restriction on being cooler back was because the brand of the product that they were buying had this sticker that said if it was in a higher temperature environment than it says on the box, the warranty is gone. Now these guys are such a sale that they're circumnavigating. They're just going straight to the source, building their own. The big thing that'll have to happen, and any of the technical people on the call will know this, is that there's different metrics for measuring the efficiency of a center. And one of them, for instance, is this thing called PUE, and it's a 1.x. And they have worked their hardest for the last 20 years, reducing the point X from 0.2 to 0.7, when the real thing is the 1. That's the energy used by the kit. And in the next 10 to 15 years, you're going to start to see things like synthetic DNA storage, which can hold hundreds of millions of times more data than we can currently on electricity. So there's going to be, you know, as is often said, we overestimate what we can achieve in 2 to 3 years, and we underestimate what we can achieve in 10. We only have a smartphone 10 years-ish. You know, but always drive it back. It's a business, and the less costs you can use, that's the drive. Even the accountants, they're the good guys for reducing costs usually.
Okay, and by the way, gentlemen, it's not all about data centers. Aidan would like to know, do I also have a TikTok cushion? And I'm sorry, Aidan, I don't. But when I source one, it will definitely be in the backdrop. But thank you for caring. I appreciate it.
I know that. I know that, Aidan. He's always asking hard questions.
Okay. So a question here from Brian Kennedy. George, if data centers have become more efficient over time due to using cloud and hyperscale technology, what enabled the flat load profile during COVID, despite increased demand for services such as Netflix, Zoom, Teams, etc.?
So that headline was actually for data transmission networks. So there is, I'm not aware of any data yet showing that data centers on the data center energy consumption yet for 2020. But that the headline from GSMA was around their network operators. So that they managed to have much higher utilization, but maintain their electricity use is fairly flat.
Okay, there's a question here from Hugo. One of the common aspects or challenges in the Americas has been the transition to renewable energy. So here we developed a standard that prohibits the use of renewables in critical functions of the data center. So what would you recommend?
Sorry.
Will I repeat the question?
Well, George has it.
Yeah, I mean, I've not heard of that, so I'll research that after this this webinar. But you know, the energy storage is getting much cheaper. There's more and more policy and government focus on hydrogen. So I think there's kind of momentum there around pairing renewables with kind of emerging technologies where there won't be a technical constraint on these things, and maybe the policy and the regulations and restrictions can ease as a result.
Okay, and I have a question in here from Willie O'Connell. Is it possible to estimate the amount of energy saved as a consequence of data center applications? For example, the number of journeys saved as a consequence of WebEx, Teams, Zoom, etc., and the saving as a consequence of more efficient traffic routing as a consequence of Google Waze. So improved efficiency of logistics, essentially, is the question there. Is it possible data centers are a net energy reduction when viewed globally?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that it's a net energy savings. I mean, considering how much business travel has been offset by Zoom meetings and different webinar tools, I think we can confidently say that. You know, the example that I brought up in the slides was around teleworking, because there are so many dynamics around that. So again, even with all these kind of digitization and moving to the digital world to reduce transportation use, it's hard to know kind of the knock-on effects. But I think I would be pretty confident in saying that given the huge reduction in business travel that's being enabled by these virtual tools, I think we're seeing a reduction in energy and emissions for sure.
But Carl, you know, the big word from a lot of people at the moment is smart. Smart this, smart that, smart grid, smart car, smart thermostat, etc. What you have to remember is the only reason it's smart is because of data in a center. You know, so a lot of them are being sold and discussed about the reduction. For instance, the Nest thermostat. The Nest thermostat is there to reduce effectively your temperatures in your house to profile you, therefore saving energy, saving carbon. And their numbers recently were 50 billion watts. 50 billion watts were saved by just that one product. That's only one product from data in a center profiling. So, you know, we could get really grumpy and we could try and offset one against the other. And as Willie says, try and end up where actually, if it wasn't for the data in the centers reducing all this energy, we'd be 4 degrees above where we hope to be. But that's the discussion that often gets forgotten, is the data is actually doing so much of the work outside of the center to reduce carbon. And that's why I like George's work, because he endeavors always to get to the net result.
Okay, now unfortunately we really only have time for possibly one more question, because we're really running out of time, and we do have about 30 unanswered questions. So Gary, perhaps you, together with the Host in Ireland team, you might be able to find a way to answer some of these questions that we won't get to today. But maybe as a final question here, there's one in from John McKeown. Does the panel think there is an existential threat to data centers from quantum computing developments?
Wow. On the basis that you can create a quantum computer out of 1,000 Raspberry Pis that you can pick up for $5 each, I'd say the answer is a bit like the mainframe. Will mainframes go away because personal computers and laptops? No, I think it's fit for purpose. We're entering an era now of fit for purpose computing. It's incredible that I mentioned a Raspberry Pi. There's what, 10,000 times more power in a $5 to $15 Raspberry Pi than put man on the moon. But it's fit for purpose. Quantum computing hopefully will solve the great unknowns of the universe and be able to speed, but there'll always be geographies, because we haven't even got started, and this discussion hasn't, about fit for purpose data centers in every district, in every municipality, in every city, edge computing. So, you know, we're only getting going at the moment. We're in an iteration 1.0 where we think it's a good idea to centralize everything. But like all IT, we'll decide that it was a shit idea and we'll then distribute everything again for another decade, and then we'll centralize it again. It often feels a bit like Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, right? After we take over the house. George,
I'm sure George Orwell would appreciate the comparison there. Unfortunately, it feels a little bit like what's happened here today. We are just getting started. There's about 30 unanswered questions. My apologies to people that we didn't get to your Q&A, and I'm going to put that back onto the responsibility of Gary and the team to find a way to get some of those answers, or some of those questions answered. So thank you so much, first of all, to Host in Ireland President Gary Connolly, and also to emerging technology analyst from IEA, George Kamea. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Again, apologies we didn't get to all the Q&A, and coming up on our next webinar, which is starting in about 5 minutes, Michelle Wallace will moderate a panel discussion between Hannah Ormondroyd and Aidy McGuinness on data centres booking the trend and actually creating jobs during this pandemic. As we saw news break earlier today from Host in Ireland that the Irish data centre industry is to add 1,800 new jobs over the next 12 months. So there will be a link that will be made available through the chat box for all panelists. So please go ahead. That's starting in 5 minutes. That's the Irish data centre industry to add 1,800 new jobs over the next 12 months. And that panel discussion with Michelle Wallace is starting in about 5 minutes. Thank you again, Gary and George. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you,
Thanks, Carol.
Team. It was fun. Thank you so much. Thanks, George.
Thanks.
I just add to that, we had lots of questions about the resources that you mentioned in the slides. So just to watch out in your inbox for a follow-up email. All of that will be coming.
Thank you.
Are we still live, Sarah? Or who's M. Goggin?